Yeah, can you hear me, William?
Yep, can hear you now.
Right. Okay. Just want to ask, are we recording this session?
Yeah, I just started the recording now.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, maybe we can start with a brief intro here. So yeah, so firstly, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending. It's always a bit of a challenge on such a beautiful sunny day, but so thank you for coming first of all. I'll just briefly introduce kind of who Sustainability Discourse is, part of Impact Hub, also the format, and then introduce Pavel. So yeah, firstly, about Sustainability Discourse. So we're a group of kind of interested people. We're all volunteer run, and we host discussion, information dissemination events focusing on areas of sustainability. And we're a tribe of Impact Hub who are a great facilitator for us. And we typically host events there with Impact Hub as part of their community. But during the sort of the COVID-19 times, we have moved to online. So this is now our event format status. And yeah, if you're interested in getting involved with us, we're very open to new ideas, themes and topics. So yeah, that's a little bit about us. The format of the talk, I'm just going to introduce Pavel. If you have any comments that you want to say throughout, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. If you also want to use your webcam, that's fine. We can also kind of open it more up towards the end. If you want to speak, you can unmute yourself and stuff. So yeah, just something comes up, mention it. And yeah. And so I can get on to introducing Pavel. He's the campaign coordinator of the Green New Deal. Really interesting group as part of DiEM25. I think I went to their book opening for the Vision for Europe, I think last year. And yeah, just the kind of the scale of the content of their ideas for me is just like really quite interesting. There's a lot of really interesting thinkers coming up behind this. And the Green New Deal is something, yeah, that's also a very interesting and important topic for our times. So yeah, I'd like to pass it over now to Pavel, and he can tell us more.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Will. And thanks to everyone who made this happen. My name is Pavel, as Will said. I co-founded and I coordinate the campaign for the Green New Deal for Europe. The campaign is it's structured as a coalition. It was convened initially by DiEM25 in May last year. And it brings together think tanks, activists, labor unions, researchers, and various other groups with a mission to define a model of the green transition that delivers on the promise of climate justice, that does what is necessary, and that really uses the multilateralism, the opportunities for multilateral cooperation that exist in Europe, that exist because of the European Union, to advance this agenda at an international scale and to model what a global transition could look like. So we put out this big report, as Will mentioned. It's about 120 pages long. I think we'll share a link at the end. And the idea was very much to define, before the European Commission had a chance to do so, or at the same time, to kind of preempt a lot of the lobbying efforts that come, to define what that vision really needs to look like and to set a benchmark for it, so that when the Commission emerged with its, we thought, inevitably inadequate vision for the transition, we would have defined a model of what it needs to look like. So when Ursula von der Leyen finally announced her Green Deal, we were paying very close attention. The first thing we found interesting was just the semantics of it. She called it a Green Deal and not a Green New Deal. And a lot of people might dismiss that as a purely semantic, as an unimportant kind of difference. But we thought it was quite instructive, because obviously the Green New Deal, as it was first conceived in the UK, as it was popularized in the United States by Bernie Sanders, by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, draws its name from the New Deal of President Roosevelt in the 30s after the Great Depression, which was kind of I wouldn't say radical, but a pretty major shift in the way that the economy was run, in the way that we thought about the relationship of finance and kind of the public and democracy and so on. So it was a kind of big leap forward. And so by stripping out the new, Ursula von der Leyen channeled the perceived radicalism of Roosevelt's New Deal, but stripped it of its substance. And then the politics of its introduction were quite interesting too. The Green Deal emerged in the wake of Europe's green wave. In the last parliamentary elections, there was a massive wave of support for green parties, almost unprecedented. There were millions of people marching in the streets to demand systemic change. And the Green Deal emerged precisely at that time, kind of drawing on a lot of that energy that was coming from the streets. And so when you contrast that rhetorical promise, this idea of a moonshot, this language that Ursula von der Leyen used in announcing the Green Deal, with the really weak policy agenda of the program, the conclusion we immediately came to is that the Green Deal would become history's most ambitious exercise in greenwashing. It's an attempt to absorb the energy and the demands of the climate movement, while entirely stripping them of their kind of radicalism and of their substance. And this core critique we have of the Green Deal, I think applies to reformism at large, or to any reformist impulses, which is that if your system is broken, if it's devastating both the planet and its people, then you can't fix the system, you have to change the system. And by promising incremental changes through the vehicle of the Green Deal or through other environmental programs, which have distant decarbonization targets, which have very weak and almost purely rhetorical commitments to social justice, these kinds of agendas suck energy out of the climate movements because they at least create the impression that something's being done. They push activists into a mode of reaction where instead of generating ideas and trying to envision a future, they're forced to respond to whatever's coming out of the European Commission or whatever institution is coming up with these policies. And you see that a lot now with a huge shift in parts of the climate movement to try and engage constructively with the Commission and push it towards more just positions. And it does very little to advance the cause of climate justice in the end. And indeed, when you scratch beneath the surface of how the Green Deal works, you start to see that, first of all, nothing new is proposed in the agenda. If you look at the financing model, for example, a lot of the money is just drawn from other budgets. It's recirculated. It's all reshuffled. And the only new amount of money is this 7.5 billion euros that was meant to be spent over 7 years with a so-called Just Transition Fund, which Germany blocked earlier this year, just before the European Parliament voted through 27 billion euros of investments in fossil fuel infrastructure in Europe. But more important than that, and this is something that's not talked about very often, is the structure of the financing. So you look at that 1.1 trillion euros that Ursula von der Leyen promised to invest over 10 years in the green transition. A lot of that money isn't invested by the public. It's not invested by Europe's public banks, but it's leveraged through a model of financing that's become quite central to the way the European Union as a whole operates, which involves subsidizing or guaranteeing the loans of private banks, which is effectively a model of subsidizing private profit while socializing the risk of investment. That means that if an investment goes bad, the public pays. If an investment goes well, then the investors pay, and whatever the outcome of that investment, whether it's a wind farm, whether it's a school, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a farm, ends up in private hands, generating profits, usually for large corporations. One example is, the Common Agricultural Policy isn't necessarily kind of tied to the financing model, but it's about 40% of the European Union's budget, which goes, 80% of which goes to the very largest farming and agricultural concerns on the continent. Almost none of it goes to small farmers. So you have this financing model, which effectively serves to siphon public money into private hands. One problem with that is that when you have investments made by private banks, they need to generate a profit, right? Banks aren't sustainable if they can't profit off of the investments they make. And so they charge interest rates. And if you're a business and you're borrowing money, you have to pay back more than you borrowed, which means that as a business, you have to grow. And there's ample evidence that growth itself, the attachment to GDP growth as the primary metric of economic success, of economic progress, is what's killing our planet, right? It's the overuse of resources. It's the overproduction of goods that depend on fossil fuels, both for their logistics and for their manufacturing. And at its core, the European Union, within its treaties and within its institutions, is committed to this idea of growth. And indeed, when Ursula von der Leyen introduced the Green Deal, she called it a growth strategy, a green growth strategy for the European Union. And it seems that it's almost impossible within that framework, within that kind of legal and institutional architecture, to tilt the Green Deal towards a mode or towards a program that would respond to the scale of the challenge that we have ahead. The other thing that we often talk about in the Green Deal is its politics. If you look at Roosevelt's New Deal, which is often praised again by progressive governments, which is often mentioned when people talk about programs like the Green New Deal, what's often overlooked is that the New Deal wasn't a set of policies introduced by a sitting president and signed into law through technocratic processes. It was won by militant labor unions, disrupting businesses, going on general strike, blocking streets, and being a thorn in the side of the authorities. Pretty much any gains that have been made throughout history, whether we're talking about the 2-day weekend, whether we're talking about the right to vote, whether we're talking about gender equality, were won through militant action. And the Green Deal at its core makes no effort to deepen the politics of transition. There's nothing in the program that might excite European citizens to come on board, to try and shape the program with the Commission, to have a say in the structure of the policy package as a whole. And indeed, if you look at Europe's great democratic moonshot, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is an attempt to democratize the process of policymaking, the Green Deal is completely excluded from that. It doesn't feature it at all. So it tells you a lot about both democracy in Europe and the extent to which the European Commission is unwilling to part with the politics of the past in this program. So I don't want to talk too much about the Green Deal, but maybe I'll talk a little bit about our own policy report and the program that we developed and the kind of thinking that we had behind it. So back in May last year, we started defining kind of few core principles that we believed would be necessary for any just transition. One of them, a very important one in our eyes, which is entirely missing from the Green Deal, is this idea of global justice. If you look at United Nations, there was a United Nations report, I think, from 2 years ago, which predicted that there will be 150 million additional refugees by 2030, per year, by 2030, because of desertification in the kind of the sub-Saharan and Northern African regions. There will be about the same number of people across the global south just because of rising temperatures, forced to become refugees. You're going to have wars breaking out in the next 9 to 10 years, and this is kind of United Nations predictions. And the European Union's Green Deal makes no meaningful effort to recognize that the countries that have historically borne the greatest responsibility for emissions, the greatest responsibility for pollution, and indeed for economic extraction across large parts of the global south, are going to be the last to pay the price for the damage they're causing. And we think it's incredibly important, and maybe the Black Lives Matter movement, which is rising now, can shed light on this, but we think it's incredibly important for countries like Europe, who have played a massive role in keeping countries across the global south poor, in recognizing that legacy, in redressing it, and in righting those wrongs by supporting other countries in their green transitions as well. Because if Europe does it, even if Europe does it successfully, and the rest of the world is left to fend for itself, then we're not going to get where we need to get. So a very core part of that program is this idea of global justice. And to have global justice, you need to reform kind of international trade, international taxation, the infrastructure of global finance, including multilateral financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. I sympathize a lot with the demand of some of the protests in the States, which says everything must go. I think we're at a historical period where some of the world's leading scientists are saying that the most likely outcome within this century or within the next couple of centuries of a changing climate is the end of human civilization. And this is no longer a moment for soft demands. This is no longer a moment, in my view, for sitting at the table and asking an institution that's structurally incapable of delivering the kind of program we need to do a little bit more, to make things a little bit less bad. And so we developed this policy paper, which probably isn't as radical now as it should be, though it seemed so then, to try and set the benchmark of what needs to happen, but more importantly, to try and signal to the climate movement, which is still very nascent, which has just started, that it's very important not only to resist, not only to fight against inaction on climate, but also to have a positive vision of what the future can look like, of what we can achieve if we win this fight, and what kind of political demands and strategies we need to have in order to make that happen. So maybe I'll leave it there, because I'd be really keen to open this up to a broader conversation, to open it up to any questions. But yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you, Pavel. That was really interesting. A really good introduction. Are there any questions so far? I've got a few for myself, but I'm happy to take questions if there are. I guess I can maybe start with my own if there's no other ones. Yeah, we can start with Ian if you like. Do you want to unmute yourself, Ian? You can go for it and ask your question.
By the way, can I ask a question? Is everyone else also in Berlin? And is everyone else also burning up right now? It's insane.
True.
Hi. Not an entirely unexpected face, I guess. Yeah, for others, I'm in DM 2022. Anyway, one question I thought, some people say, oh, well, you can't really predict that there'll be like that wars will take place, or that there'll be this certain number of climate refugees, because like on the basis that it's not really possible to directly trace any event and say this couldn't have happened if climate change weren't a factor. Like I don't really subscribe to this kind of thought myself, but it's something that people say. Like, what do you think of that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to be honest, this isn't my field at all, but I've spoken to a NASA scientist at one point, long story. They have a whole team which does kind of political modeling based on climate models. So they look at what's happening on the ground in terms of population movements. They look at changing climate, increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, and they've actually predicted, not accurately, but with some kind of degree of certainty, what's going to happen in places like Bangladesh, which is already kind of starting to feel the effects of global warming quite severely, and in that part of the world, what's going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa. And you look at a very simple factors. For example, if you have temperatures which reach a point which isn't sustainable for human life, and you have a certain population that lives there, you can anticipate that most of the people will leave, some of the people will stay, some of the people will die. And so I think the models are kind of based on those things. But moving kind of beyond whether or not they're right, and there's a lot of doubt about all the climate models because this stuff is all notoriously difficult to model. I think it's important to not treat their inaccuracy as a sign that we shouldn't do anything or that we shouldn't act as radically as possible in the moment. Because what if the worst comes to pass, right? What if it's as bad as the climate models predict? And in fact, the climate models are being revised constantly in ways that suggest we have less time than we previously thought. So it's better to apply the principle of precaution and to do more than is necessary rather than less, which is what we're doing now.
Great, thank you. I guess the kind of follow-up question that I have about this is like, did you consider in your policies those effects to some degree? So do you have like mass migration policies, for example, like given that Bangladesh will be uninhabitable in 10 years or 50 years, would you be radical enough? Is it radical enough to have to consider that in the policies to say, given that there's going to be potential food shortages or mass migrations? I just wondered if that's like potentially a component of it.
So it's not explicitly, migration policy isn't explicitly a component of our report. It's more of an omission because we lack the expertise to have it, and also because DM has a separate kind of migration pillar where these issues are considered. And so we didn't think it necessary to cover in the report. But one of the points which I talked about earlier is the need to support other nations in their green transitions and support them in their economic development. And the way a lot of economic development happens now, there was a blog by the French development ministry, or one of the French development banks, which said that for every $1 that we give in foreign aid to Africa, we extract $3 in resources that aren't paid for at kind of fair amounts, in terms of wages, in terms of corruption, in terms of interest rates, in terms of all kinds of. So there is an ongoing process of plunder, which is plugged into the kind of infrastructure of global trade, and also, as I said earlier, the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which will come in, which will bail out a country that's suffering financially, and then say, okay, to be able to afford this, you need to sell off all of your public assets to us or to banks from the global north. So you have this process of privatization, which has been gutting governments across Africa, across South America. And if you stop those policies, if you reverse those policies, for example, by supporting public ownership, by supporting agroecology, instead of undercutting, as the European Union does, African and Southeast Asian farmers on price with shitty kind of European produce, which forces millions of people out of rural communities into slums, and also causes a massive loss of knowledge about agroecology and sustainable forms of agriculture. And if instead of that process, you support people in developing sustainable community-owned businesses that are local, and that kind of respect those traditions, then you're more likely to safeguard the conditions for people staying in their countries rather than being forced to leave. So this is the same argument for reparations as well. When we talk about slavery, when we talk about the history of colonialism, so we don't address the question of migration explicitly, and it's a very complex one. But we talk about the urgent need to support other countries as they also grapple with this situation.
Hi.
Okay, great. Okay, Haram, go for it.
Yeah, hi, Pavel. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I'm quite looking forward to look at the report. So far I haven't looked at. I'm quite interested in your comments about scale of climate issues and global justice. So you say that the proposed EU initiative doesn't actually look at it, or is not doing enough. Can you shed some light or further discuss about in terms of Paris Climate Agreement, with reference to global justice, are they doing enough? Or if they are not, what is unique about the Green New Deal that you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, so they're doing very little. One of them, one of the ways in which the European Commission's Green Deal tries to account for emissions that take place in other countries is to impose, and this isn't something that's already part of the Green Deal, it's something that's proposed potentially at some point in the future. And we know that these things are notoriously difficult within the European Union to negotiate and agree. It's a border carbon tax, which would basically tax goods coming into Europe, which are carbon intensive at a higher rate to disincentivize them being imported. The effect of that is, rather than supporting countries who might not have the resources to undertake these kinds of transitions, it imposes additional costs on them when they produce goods that don't meet European standards. And this is another kind of super protectionist policy, which is very consistent with what the European Union has done in the past. At the same time, there's a massive, massive expansion in border controls and border policing, huge expansion in the number of kind of forces attached to Frontex, which is the kind of institution that patrols the Mediterranean and prevents refugees from coming into Europe. There is a strategy being floated now to create European champions. There was a 100 billion euro fund proposed last year to basically create, the European Google or the European Microsoft to compete with the United States and with China. And so a lot of these policies are about strengthening the power of European corporations in order to make them competitive on a global scale. But there's very little about climate justice, about supporting others. There's almost nothing in the agenda about that. And even when we talk about people in the European Union, I mean, we have to remember, this was before the United Kingdom left, so I don't know if the numbers still hold, and there aren't more recent ones, but a few years ago, 116 million people, 1 out of 5 in the European Union, were at risk of poverty or social exclusion. 1 out of 10, about 50 million people, couldn't afford to heat their homes in the winter. This is from, the first statistic is from a European Commission report. The second one is from a report commissioned by the European Commission. So we have this deep, deep, deep level of poverty that also isn't being addressed. And it's getting worse, right? When we look at the coronavirus and when we look at other issues. So I think the Commission is failing on that entirely. You're right to say that in the Paris Agreement, there is a clause that there's a clause that says that nations that are the least responsible for the crisis shouldn't, pay more of a burden than nations that are most responsible for it. But what we're seeing now is precisely the opposite. The nations that are least responsible for the crisis are having to pay a lot more and sacrifice a lot more than the European Union or the United States. So unfortunately, there isn't much progress on that front. But I hope, as I said earlier, that the fact that Europe is now starting to reckon through this protest, this rebellion that started in the US, with the legacy of colonialism, some of these questions are being asked. And if we keep asking those questions, it could force that conversation in a way that wasn't possible before.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a couple of comments by George. I just wonder if you'd want to unmute yourself and maybe raise those points, possibly, George.
Okay, I'm from the USA, and I'm trying to get some idea of what's happening in Europe. From my reading of the Green New Deal here, it's less radical than the 1979 Carter Energy Plan in a lot of ways. And from my understanding of some of the people, listening to some of the people behind it, there doesn't seem to be a very good hold on the actual economics of the energy sector in the United States. You know, there's no idea of the scale of what the energy sector is and how big a part of the economy it is and how much it costs every year. We pay, from my back of the envelope estimates, about $649 billion per year for the oil, the gas, and the coal that we burn. And then I guess the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank did a study a year ago about subsidies. And they saw that the United States spent another 600+ billion in subsidies for those commodities. So we spend about $1.2 trillion per year on the fuels that we burn. You know, that's enormous. And how do you pay for a Green New Deal? Well, you transition away from that. The other thing is that in the United States, there's a Republican plan, which is not garnered a lot of support from the Republicans, but it's George Shultz and Jim Baker, who are, you know, supposedly wise old men, the Baker-Shultz plan, which also talks about cross-border equalization with a carbon tax. And on a previous Zoom call this morning, I understand from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's a Democratic senator, that the Democrats are also looking at cross-border equalization with a carbon tax as well. So those are the things that I brought up in the comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Green New Deal is that it's a very mimetic concept. Everyone projects onto it whatever they think it should be and whatever they want it to be, and that makes it ripe for co-optation. Which is why when you look at the Green New Deal proposals of Elizabeth Warren and compare it to the Green New Deal proposal of Joe Biden, of Bernie Sanders, and then compare it to whatever climate agenda Joe Biden's coming out, there's completely different programs, completely different scales of radicality, completely different scales of action, but they are being called the same thing. Now, if you look at purely the size of the Green Deal, it's, as I mentioned, 1.1 trillion euros over 10 years, about $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's less than half of what the European Commission itself says is necessary for the green transition. So the European Commission in 2018 published a paper which said we'll need about 260 billion euros a year to make this work. The European Court of Auditors, which is kind of the auditing arm of the European Union, published a paper that said that the energy transition alone will cost 1.125 trillion euros every year for 10 years. Or every year for 5 years, something like that. So they're wildly off even their own account of what needs to happen. And I asked the European Commission about this a few months ago, well, before the quarantine. And she said, well, you know, member states will have to make up the difference. Now, the problem with that argument is that embedded in the treaty architecture of the European Union, you have limits on state spending. You can't have a budget deficit that exceeds a certain percentage. And there's like a loan to GDP ratio that also can't be exceeded. And so a lot of states are basically entirely constrained in how they make public investments, which puts everything in the ballpark of the European Union. And so one of the things we propose in our paper is that we use this institution called the European Investment Bank, which is a kind of, you know, if we had to invent a bank to power the green transition and build it from the ground up, it would look very much like the European Investment Bank. And we would get it to issue a financial instrument, a debt instrument, a green bond, which would be sold to the private sector. There's a lot of kind of unused money being flown around in the financial industry. I don't know the numbers are in the EU, but in the UK, 60% of bank lending goes to other banks. So it's banks giving money to each other. The idea is you create this really safe investment, and everyone's in need of a safe investment these days. You sell it into the financial industry. Like a sponge, it absorbs a lot of the unused money in the industry, and then we say that that money should be invested democratically with the participation of European communities. Because right now you have 8 people sitting in Frankfurt, Germany, who decide where the funds of the European Investment Bank get invested throughout the European Union. So it's also a deeply undemocratic structure. Now, I don't know if there's much sense comparing the US Green New Deal with the European one, just because the political contexts are so different. The nature of kind of political discourse is very different. You have a bipartisan system, just deeply fragmented, and that really limits what's possible in a different way than maybe the European political architecture limits what's possible in the EU. Of course, the agendas are okay, Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey published this, was it like a 10-page bill on the Green New Deal, which doesn't really do all that much. The agendas that were kind of more radical, like Bernie Sanders' proposals, are dead in the water because he's no longer a candidate. So it's very difficult to talk about an American Green New Deal when there isn't anything concrete on the table that can actually be implemented. And then equally, it's very it's kind of not worth comparing to the European model, because the European model doesn't do what's necessary, and it's quite likely to fail as well for various reasons, which we can go into later.
So I think George has got his hand raised. Does that mean he would like to speak again?
Yeah, a comment and a question. There is one piece of legislation that is part of the Green New Deal that's been filed, which is for public housing. And what they want to do is they want to make all public housing in the United States net zero energy within 10 years of when they start accessing the funds that will be made available through this bill. So that's one thing. Carter was talking about insulating 80 to 90% of our buildings, our homes, within 6 years in 1979. So that's one reason why I say it's less radical now than it was then. My question is, a friend of mine has been studying very closely what Greta Thunberg is doing, and she persistently talks about the carbon budget. And I'm wondering if people are using that way of framing the climate problem, as well as the financial incentives, or the investment, because we only have a certain amount of carbon that we can emit. All right, the atmospheric chemists and scientists tell us, before we're in greater trouble than we have now. So if we use a 2-track method of looking at the carbon budget and then looking at the economic budget to do the development that we need, it might be a 1-2 punch that could be useful both in the United States and in the EU.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple of things about that. First of all, Greta's right in attacking a lot of the climate agendas that are being put forward, even by kind of notionally progressive forces, because especially if you look at the US case, especially if you look at kind of, Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, there's this kind of American industrial romanticism embedded in these initiatives, where they say, we're going to do this $16 trillion Green Deal, and we're going to make America the greatest force for the manufacture of green technologies in the world. We're going to export them to everyone else, and we'll be a global superpower again. And that's precisely the opposite of what has to happen, because just producing more stuff, windmills use rare minerals, which are extracted mostly from the global south. The European Union, like the Americans, loves to fetishize electric cars, but electric cars use lithium, and the process of extracting lithium is deeply destructive to the environment, and also tends to come with a whole kind of array of human rights abuses. So the whole point that Greta often makes is you can't grow your way out of this crisis. And she's right. My kind of big beef with Greta is that she has no political analysis. Greta will go to Congress, she'll go to the European Parliament, and she'll say, hey guys, here's the IPCC report. I recommend you read it, and then you'll understand what to do. And that's not how politics works. That's not how power works. And the way that the climate movement has formed, not so much in the US. I think in the US, if you look at the Sunrise Movement, they're highly political. They understand political strategy. They make tactical alliances. But in Europe, a lot of activists are like, well, no, we're not political. We're just, asking politicians to listen. We're not supporting any political party. We don't like politics. We don't want to get engaged in politics. And until they do, nothing's going to change, because this whole thing is about the balance of power within the political economy. And so, a big part of what we've been trying to do is to politicize and radicalize some of these movements, to push them towards positions that would have some kind of political strategy embedded in it, rather than just kind of reactively calling for systems change.
Yeah, that's super interesting to critique the sort of like the movements. I've also often been thinking about this, about how to kind of capture this this obvious dissent. I mean, the climate protest last year, they were just absolutely vast. And part of me wonders, this is one of the questions I have, maybe it's a kind of a cheeky question, but why do you think the idea of the Green New Deal has not caught on more yet? Like, why is it not such that this is the way that we think that, political change, this is often the discussion we're having, like, who should make the changes? Should we as individuals like consume more healthily? And it seems like that seems to be like almost like an expectation that we have to change our diets, we have to change the way we move, we transport ourselves and so on. And I just wonder why there is seemingly less desire for political movements. Kind of your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of the existential question, right? I think what you describe isn't so true in the US. And in fact, what we're seeing now with the rebellions breaking out across the country, but also, this act, if you look at places like what's it called, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, where people have claimed this bit of the city and have actually repurposed it to build a new community with its own fire service, with its own health services, with its own food production. There is a kind of impulse not only to organize transient actions like a lot of European movements do. So like, oh, we're going to do one day in 5 months, and then we're going to make a splash, and then hopefully things will change. But there's this kind of effort that's existed for decades to try and build from the ground up the kind of alternative power structures that could maybe one day replace the dominant economic and political system. And so in Europe, you don't really have that anymore, although that kind of radicalism, that kind of militancy was rife in Europe, half a century ago. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that a social democracy caught on in Europe a lot more. And the process of kind of the neoliberal erosion of the social democratic structures was much slower and much more gradual in much of Europe, not counting Southern Europe, than it was in the States. So, in Germany, you still have a decent social safety net. You still have decent healthcare, even although you have this weird system of private insurance intermediation and, half private, half public institutions. You still have relatively decent infrastructure. And, you don't have a system where if you lose your job, you lose your house and you lose your healthcare, which inevitably pushes people out into the streets in rebellion. And so I think, on one hand, maybe things just have to get that much worse for Europeans for them to really build up this kind of political identity, and to start going out into the streets in a serious and in a durable way, and in a way that maintains pressure. But I think these things are starting to happen. I mean, France already, across France, you have sustained protests for the past year, basically, by the Gilets jaunes movement, which also, we have to remember, began as a protest against the environmental agenda, because Macron wanted to implement a fuel tax, which would have shifted the burden of the transition away from fuels onto the very poorest people. And so that's, again, the whole idea of a Green New Deal, is that no one's left behind and we lift up everyone at once, and put the costs on those who are most responsible for causing the damage, which is the companies, the fossil fuel companies, the energy companies, and so on. But yeah, I mean, this question of why aren't we more organized? Why aren't labor unions in Europe demanding more? Why aren't social movements in Europe more political? I think has to do both with, as I said, the fact that Europe is still relatively okay, or at least parts of Europe are relatively okay compared to the US, compared even to Britain, I mean the European Union, but also because the way the European Union's become structured with a kind of transnational system of economic governance that isn't really responsive to national sovereignty and democratic accountability at a national level, means that there are certain questions that just feel out of they feel beyond the remit of individual or even collective action because they happen somewhere else, right? And there's that famous Wolfgang Schäuble, the former finance minister of Germany, once famously said that elections shouldn't be allowed to determine economic policies, right? And there's this idea that's deeply embedded at the heart of the European Union, that the economy is something for the management, to be managed by professionals, to be managed by experts behind closed doors, and then democracy can happen in the realm of politics. And now we're kind of seeing the effects of that, I think, both with this weak climate agenda, but also with the fact that we continue to subsidize, multinational corporations and huge banks while failing to provide a basic standard of living for a significant part of the European population.
I would have also something to say about that, if I may. Yeah, I think that the individualization of the solutions of problems is it comes from neoliberal culture, and I would, at least from my experience with Americans, I would say that it is also, like there is a lot of a narrative about individual actions to stop climate change there as well, for much the same reason. Like there's a really good article that was written by somebody last year, but they were in America. It's called "I Don't Care If You Recycle. I Want You to Join the Movement" or something.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I'll actually post it in the chat. But yeah, I mean, it is strange that nobody talks about individual action, like everyone taking individual actions to solve unemployment. But I think just because the climate change came along as a public concern for the first time during the peak of the neoliberal era in the early 2000s, I think it ended up unfortunately getting locked into this sort of narrative about being. And I think that over the last couple of years we've actually had a blossoming of the understanding of the need for collective action and movements compared to what it was like before.
I agree.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was great. Any more questions?
Can I ask hi?
Yeah.
Someone
there's
asking a question.
two. There's one from Haram and one from Doretta, so you can go for it, Haram. And then... Oops, you're muted.
I'll go later.
Okay, Doretta, would you like to go for it?
Okay, well, I was thinking, you said you were talking to the committee at the European Parliament, and I was asking myself if they were thinking while they wrote that new plan about the desertification in Africa, if they honestly starting doing the hydrogen in the desert over there in Africa, because this will force the power of desertification, and this will also force the power of migration to Europe, and how they want to compensate this problem, because we have that Frontex problem, so there are a lot of problems running. do you have the feeling that they have a complete picture of the situation at all, or they just ignore it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, and I really, try never to attribute these things to questions of individual ignorance, although individual ignorance plays a role here. I think one of the things that really shocked me, kind of when I still spoke with people in the European Parliament and politicians, is the extent to which they have no ideas. They don't know what to call for. They don't know what demands to make. They don't even know what language to use to criticize the European Commission's own project. And one of the most surreal experiences of my life is hearing like a 60-year-old guy at a conference basically word for word repeat my criticism of the European Commission's Green Deal. Because like there's just a void somehow within these institutions. But even if they all had full knowledge of what was going on and they all had complete information, I think the way that the European Union is constructed would make it very difficult for them to realize an agenda that's more just. I mean, if you just, you look at the history of European integration, right? For a long time, there was a huge reluctance to integrate countries because of a fear that countries would lose national sovereignty and hand it over to unaccountable technocrats. And then in the 80s, you had this group form, which was the CEO of Fiat, the CEO of two other huge, I think Volvo, and the CEO of Philips, along with like 12 other industrial leaders who formed this lobby, which started pushing really hard and getting really deep into the kind of institutions of the EU, pushing really hard for the creation of the single market. And in their eyes, the single market would be a vehicle for the expansion of European companies beyond national borders to create these kinds of European champions that, again, would be able to compete on the international scale. And that's the kind of way of thinking that somehow got absorbed into the European institutions through the Single Market Act later in the 50s, and then through the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s, which also took advantage of the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed and all of that political horizon was basically discredited. And very quickly, East Germany was absorbed into West Germany and brought into the kind of European Union through that. And the Maastricht Treaty, which was also about kind of creating the Eurozone, it started imposing these budget constraints on states and started, there's an explicit policy of growth written into the treaties. And when you have a single market, which is based on basically a bonfire of regulations, just burning regulations throughout the European Union to create a single market which kind of meets the very minimum standards across all countries, which facilitate the movement of corporations, but don't really facilitate the movement of people, right? So, okay, we can travel freely as tourists, but if you're working in a factory in Poland, which is owned by a German company, and you have really low wages compared to German counterparts, you have no mechanisms to exert collective power across borders against the German company. So it's a system which facilitates corporate power at an international scale, but constrains worker power to the domestic scale, and that's by design. It was a group of industrial lobbyists who basically, designed the European Union as it exists today, along with all of the kind of fiscal constraints. And so I don't know that this is a question of individual ignorance. I think this is a question of design.
I know these are just contracts, and these contracts are actually made for keeping peace in Europe, but actually these are contracts by big companies, and these people have dealt with it. But somehow, is that fourth part to have transparency and fourth column to control everything, and independent column, is that not part anymore? Actually, you know what I mean?
What do you mean about transparency within the European Union?
Yeah.
In what sense?
In sense of controlling, for instance, lobby and decisions, and who, what is it? It's the Commission that has not to. They just send It's not the ministers, they are just sent and they make the decisions and they can block everything. So
yeah, there is a lot of that, and it's very difficult for lobbyists to kind of gain access to the European institutions in some cases. But I think, if you look beyond what happens in the day, it's not so much about the influence that corporations have over the process, although it's huge, right? Investment banks, hedge funds, huge lobbyists, they have direct access to European Commission officials. They have direct access to ministries of finance and civil services across the European Union. Like, I used to work for the British Ministry of Finance, and like the bankers had me on speed dial. They would call me after a closed door meeting in Brussels to tell me what they did and what they didn't like. So they're really plugged into these processes. But even without that influence, when your overt goals are economic growth and competitiveness and competition, which are all deeply neoliberal concepts, but they're written into the treaties, when those are the overarching goals of all of your actions as a legislator, as a policymaker, then with or without corporate influence, you're still doing things within the very, very narrow ideological confines of the neoliberal system. And so again, I don't think it's about individual responsibility. I don't think it's about individual pressure. It's about the whole architecture.
Do you have a question, Haram, maybe?
Yeah, so in a way, I guess if I'm correct, what you're saying is you as an organization, you come up with ideas, but influencing change through the political political system, or influencing the status quo, that's not possible. And it's it's more about grassroots activism, right?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and my additional question to that is, you do talk about agitation for change, and what kind of agitation are you looking at? And would it be just another movement and then which fades out? Why are you hopeful? Or the challenges that you face, and in terms of what are the challenges that you face in your initiative within DiEM25, and what are the opportunities out there that you can tap on?
Yeah, so I mean, so there is, I guess the first part of the question is what are the mechanisms, or what are the levers of power that are available to us to affect this kind of change at the scale necessary? And it's a really difficult question. I don't think anyone has a clear answer. And in last summer, you had the Fridays for Future protests worldwide, which I think ended up being one of the biggest protests in Germany's history. Something like 2.5% of the German population came out into the streets to protest against climate inaction. And then last week, 2 weeks ago, Germany opened a new coal plant. If those protests had been successful, Germany wouldn't be opening new coal plants right now, right? And so there's a sense in which those protests aren't, despite having numbers, aren't powerful enough and aren't having the right kind of impact to affect that change. And I think, if you look at how they went, it's a lot of kids. It's being led by the youth. They had permission. They had everything was set up. They had police protection. It all, it was a nice parade through the city. There was music, there was dancing, and then everyone went home. And that's kind of it. And if you look at the history of social struggle, of social change, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the kind of movement, for the franchise, for the vote for women, whether you look at the movement for a 5-day work week, whether you look at the movement for an 8-hour workday, that wasn't won through purely peaceful organizing methods. It was won through disruptive organizing methods, such as industrial action, just shutting down cities, shutting down factories, grinding the economy to a halt until the demands were met. And one of the big weaknesses of the climate movement is that it's kids. Like, no one cares if kids don't go to school, right? It doesn't hurt anyone. Teachers are probably happy. If workers don't go to the office, for a day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, then the economy starts really crumbling. So there has to be a way for the climate movement to become more of a threat.
Yeah, but there's also Ende Gelände who do these who like invade coal mines basically a couple of times a year in Germany, and yeah, they say even that doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, but I think it's also it doesn't work because it works from any kind of strategy for the transition of power. So you have to your goal has to be to take power. And to wield that power in a particular way. And that's not happening. We're not seeing that in Europe. And so one of the things we've been looking at is you have a few municipalities around Europe which are doing really interesting work on the climate. You have Barcelona, which has one of the most radical climate agendas in the European Union. Amsterdam recently adopted the donut economics model. And there are a few other cities here and there that are really pushing the boundaries of what is possible at a municipal level, but also going way further than their national governments are going on the climate. And so one of the things I've been exploring, and I've been speaking to a few of these governments, is creating some kind of network between them where they can share resources, share best practices, kind of share strategies, and demonstrate that at a different level of politics, you can also create a kind of transnational Green New Deal, which does a lot more than the European Commission's agenda does. So kind of building up the structure of dual power through the municipalist movements, which is another approach. Beyond that, you know, the political arithmetic is really bad. The coronavirus made things even worse, with popularity for establishment parties kind of surging across most countries. The amount of money that is being lost now is likely to justify a very severe round of austerity, just as it did in 2008. So, you know, the prospects are really bad actually right now. And I don't think anyone can say what's going to happen. But, you know, the past few years have been a massive exercise in the impossible. So,
yeah. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, you kind of addressed a question that I was sort of having in my mind, like how you sort of collaborate or what your opinions are with like other political parties and whether or not you kind of interacted with them in different ways, but that was sort of addressed.
I guess there's one more point, if I can quickly make it, which is that I'm starting to kind of change my thinking about this, where I used to think that a lot of the, you know, the change, the momentum has to come from within Europe to transform it, because Europe historically is one of the greatest kind of instigators of climate change and environmental breakdown. But because there's been this massive failure on both the part of the European movements and the part of European politics to confront these issues, I'm starting to get a sense that actually the solutions lie at a more international scale. And if you look at, you know, where the big corporations operate, where the big banks operate, where the big fossil fuel companies operate, they operate at an international scale. And when we're working nationally or even within the European Union, say, to stop fracking, we're playing this game of, you know, whack-a-mole. You know, appears here, you whack it, it appears here afterwards. And you know, you look at fracking, right? Fracking gets shut down. Germany bans fracking LNG terminals in Germany. So frack gas gets imported to Barcelona and Spain. Ireland recently banned imports. It gets imported into Greece, and now Greece is building a terminal. And so when you try and address these issues at a national scale, you inevitably just shift those activities elsewhere. But if you can build international pressure across all of the sites where a company is operating, then you have you're much more likely to be able to hurt it in a meaningful way and shut down its activities altogether, rather than simply pushing them to a place with weaker regulations, weaker social movements, and less of an ability to resist. So international coordination, international solidarity, for want of a better word, I think will be a very important tool in addressing these issues. And just, you know, by way of a little plug, we recently launched a new movement called the Progressive International, whose mission is precisely that, is to try and scale up activism beyond the national and to build up these transnational structures where people can coordinate. And, you know, if you're taking on a company like Amazon, Doesn't matter if you do it in one warehouse or two warehouses or three warehouses. You have to do it everywhere where the company operates. You're fighting against fracking. You have to do it at the site of production and the site of consumption, or it's just not going to have the impact you want. So the idea is to try and thread through these different spheres of struggle into a common one that can build up that power to take on these international companies and forces.
Yeah, just a thought on that. Of course, social change. I'm just frustrated in terms of like, if you talk about climate change or issues of the future, everyone cares. Like, do you want your grandchildren to have a good environment or good opportunity in life? Everyone cares. But when it comes to action, there is this, nothing happens. We have strikes and it looks good on media, the attendance and things like that. So the idea of taking opportunities in places or good practices, sharing, networking with municipality, I think, or best practices in business, I think that's changes through small ways. I think that's a good idea. Which comes back to just a question to you, or if you can share a thought about mayors for climate change and the European taxonomy of sustainable activities. What are your thoughts on, or are you involved in such organization or activities?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first. The European taxonomy of sustainable investments is that the European Commission's been developing for about 5 years. And the idea, or maybe longer, it's one of those things that's kind of been talked about for a long time and hasn't really seen the light of day. And the idea is that you would create this taxonomy or this classification system, which can classify investments as either green or not green or different. Actually, I think actually they're either green or not green, which is a big problem. They're not different shades of green. And there's a question of how you use that. And there are good ways and bad ways to use it. And in classic European fashion, one of the ideas that's floating around, not only in the European Union, but also at the multilateral level of the G20, there's a group called the Sustainable Finance Study Group, which is chaired by the United Kingdom and China for a while. And they kind of do research that ends up becoming part of the global banking regulatory framework. They had this idea to take this taxonomy and identify certain types of investments as green, and then to securitize those investments with a product called a collateralized loan obligation, which is what basically brought down the global economy in 2008, which is a tool that allows banks to offload risk of investment. So you create this kind of investment vehicle, you load it with money, and then that investment vehicle buys an asset and owns that asset, and then that investment vehicle gets a rating and so on. And these things are notoriously opaque. And the idea was that you would create this taxonomy, you would identify certain assets as green, and then any investments that were made into green products or kind of infrastructure projects or whatever, wouldn't be subject to the same regulatory requirements as everything else. So it was a massive deregulation, kind of massive push for deregulation using the green agenda as a pretext to reduce the burden on banks and to help them make even more money and potentially create an even riskier investment environment. So, the thing that we call for in our report on the taxonomy is, first of all, it should identify degrees of greenness and brownness. It should never incentivize green investments, but it should actively punish brown investments, to just impose massive, massive, massive costs on any bank, any institution that's investing in fossil fuel products or anything in that kind of constellation of environmentally destructive industries. So that's on the taxonomy. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's going to achieve much. I don't think it's a useful measure, and we've lost a ton of political capital negotiating this thing over 5 years. It needs to be much bolder than it is. The second was about the mayors. There's this thing called the C40 Mayors Initiative, and I think there are a couple kind of products, a couple of projects that are similar to it, which are basically coalitions of municipal leaders and municipal authorities that commit to certain targets. I haven't looked at them in detail, but in principle, I think it's a model that's really powerful because, as I said earlier, building up this kind of model of a green transition from the municipal level upwards at least signals that those kinds of changes are politically possible somewhere. And when you open up the realm of political possibility, then you also open up the chance that people will ask for more in their political demands, in their activism, and so on. So a big part of this whole thing is to expand people's imagination of what's possible. And I think initiatives like the one you described can do that. Although I haven't looked in detail at what their kind of policies are.
I think, from my opinion, with regards to European taxonomy for sustainable finance, I think something is better than nothing. I think without those clear standardization and terminology, probably there is more greenwashing happening. That might, to a certain extent, reduce. I understand your point of, it opens another door for greenwashing, but I think that is a lesser evil than not having anything. But of course, the political opportunity that's lost in that 5 years, that is a shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's been a kind of struggle in my mind for the past year, but I don't necessarily think I agree that something is better than nothing. I think something, in the case of climate change, that something that isn't enough is also inevitably going to lead to massive loss of life, massive destruction of natural habitats, political instability, conflict, things that we're already seeing happening today. And maybe they'll happen 5 years later or 10 years later because of the Green Deal, but they're going to happen. And I'm kind of starting to believe, looking also at what's happening in the US, that the sooner we get to this point of social crisis that pushes people beyond the point of no return, where the frustration is so deep that nothing short of total systemic transformation will do, until we have that moment, we're not going to do what's necessary to stave off civilizational collapse. I don't know what to think about scientists who say that civilizational collapse is the most likely outcome. But if you look at models, the models for warming now, which point to 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by 2100, there was a model that was put out showing that the Sahara Desert will expand to southern Poland in a 4-degree scenario, right? Which could happen by 2075 in 50 years or so. So this is serious existential stuff. And it demands kind of serious existential responses from the public.
I agree. Yeah.
So this was a point that Doretta raised in the comments, and also that I was thinking about. You mentioned Fridays for Future and their kind of lack of political direction. So do you think that this is necessary to try and politicize those groups? Are you involved with any of that direction? Also with groups like Extinction Rebellion and possibly Ende Gelände as well?
Yeah, so we've worked a lot with Fridays for Future, and Fridays for Future, it's a super decentralized, like Extinction Rebellion, federated institution where you have sometimes you'll have a city formation of Fridays for Future, which is more powerful than the national one, which and better organized and more political. And so you have really different kind of different qualities to these different groups and different levels of political analysis and understanding. We found that actually in Berlin, Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion are very tuned into what's happening, very tuned into what needs to happen. And I worked a lot with them to organize some protests outside the Ministry of Finance, specifically around divestment from fossil fuel assets and things like that. But on the whole, there's still a reluctance to adopt political strategies. And by political strategies, I don't just mean endorsing political parties or specific candidates. In fact, that did happen. There was a massive surge in support for Green parties in the May 2019 elections. But a lot of the Green parties are not green in any meaningful sense of the term. As Greta said, just because you have green in your name doesn't mean that you're green, right? They're mostly neoliberal parties. They support privatization. They support, private investment over public investment, all of this stuff. And so they're also not the vehicles for change. So by politicization, more than, I mean, not just allying with political parties that do what's necessary, but also having the political analysis to understand what's going on. I think that understanding is a very necessary precondition of anything. And then when you understand, you can make up your own mind as to whether you want to support a party, or you want to bring down the system, or you want to, you know, shut down a factory, or whatever else you want to do. But I think you have to come from a position of understanding, because if your whole thing is like, oh, I wish the parliament would read the IPCC report, then that's not what's going to advance your agenda. And still, a lot of the climate movement is stuck in that mindset, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a challenge because that also requires a lot of education. And as you said about the whole idea of sort of comfort being a limitation, and especially in Europe, whereby, yeah, it's kind of, we have it good enough. So to kind of force a really radical social change, we'd have to kind of change, yeah, take out ourselves from this kind of comfort zone. So, and to educate yourself along these things is incredibly uncomfortable. To read the IPCC report is incredibly unnerving, to see the worst case scenario predictions. And yeah, I talk about it with some people and they're like, I just don't want to hear about it. And it's sometimes a case of a head in the sand is, yeah, a push towards more of this comfort zone. But it's really, we have to kind of, yeah, really kind of stare quite deeply into this abyss that is oncoming. Do we have any final questions? I guess we can close it up at past or so, but any final points want to be made?
Yeah,
I guess
I think,
okay, yeah, go
sorry,
for it.
It comes back to my frustration. Are you hopeful, Pavel, that change will come? Or, you know, like lots of challenges, and are you hopeful?
I think I'm incredibly hopeful seeing what's happening, not just in the US, but also in other places. I mean, 2019 was called the global year of protest. You had unrest from Libya to, you know, to Chile, to the United States, to France, to Italy. A lot of the country was kind of revolting against something. And then, of course, there's the whole climate movement, which really only started in the past 2 years. And now very quickly, the political and economic situation has become so aggravated around the world that a lot of people who were quite moderate have become radicalized and have really upped the stakes of what their, you know, what their demands are, what their activism is. And one of the really beautiful things when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement and its various expressions around the world is that it's at its core a demand for decolonization and a demand for human dignity, which doesn't only apply to one category of people. It applies to all kinds of people, right, all around the world. And when you have Europeans starting to take seriously, for the first time in ever, the legacy of European colonialism, then you open pathways for politics which is more respectful of people in other countries, and you open a pathway towards a politics which not only acknowledges but also works to redress those issues. And we're not there yet. The European Union had this ridiculous vote a couple of days ago on issuing an apology for colonialism, and there was this big debate, and Britain was like, well, we're not going to issue an apology, we're going to say we regret what happened. And then the European Union was like, well, we're not going to say it was a crime against humanity because maybe we'll have to pay reparations because maybe we'll be legally liable. So, you know, there's a lot of flip-flopping around this now, but it's like week 2 of these protests, right? And who knows how far this movement can take it. And this movement has superseded the climate movement, but the beauty of you know, issues like the climate is that they're not just about the climate. They're fundamentally about justice, about respect, about ensuring that people can live a dignified life, free from oppression, whether it's state oppression or, you know, or just the oppression of poverty and indignity and exploitation. And when you fix that problem, I think the climate will also have to be addressed, because a lot of these causes, a lot of these issues are linked up together. So I have hope, but time is running out. And I think if this movement fails, and the broader movement that is kind of convening around it fails, then the kind of hammer of the state is gonna hit hard, and it's gonna hit on the left, as it always does. And then it's going to destroy the prospects of justice for potentially a generation, for potentially so long that there will be no coming back.
I like your optimism. I'm a little bit pessimistic. Thank you.
I don't think that was all that optimistic, what I just said, but
okay.
There's a difference between hope and optimism, I think, right? And yeah, so I'm hopeful. I'm not necessarily optimistic.
Okay, thanks.
I was going to ask, what are the kind of what's the kind of current roadmap for you? Well, like what things are you involved in currently, and maybe just an insight in current developments. Maybe that would be interesting.
I mean, I've really been dedicating a lot of my focus beyond working on these municipal programs and trying to kind of understand where those levers of power are in the EU. I've been dedicating a lot of my energies towards this progressive international movement. Thank you, Ian, for sharing the link to the Green New Deal for Europe campaign. I'll also share the link to the other initiative. And really, this project is about building out international connections between movements and labor unions and activist groups and politicians and political parties, and creating in them this idea, which used to exist but was kind of eroded over the past few decades, that your struggle is, or someone else's struggle is also your struggle, right? This idea Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we're working on growing this movement now, but the idea is of coordinating actions. And a very simple example of how that might work is I worked with a friend of mine in Berlin who is a Argentinian anti-fracking activist some time ago to organize the first international anti-fracking protest. And the idea was to have simultaneous actions in Argentina, in the United States, in Ireland, and in Spain. These are all sites either of production or distribution or consumption of fracked gas. To show that we understand the way in which these organizations operate. And so I think the next few months are going to be about learning from people about what it is that it would take to scale up activism to a more international level, to scale up people's understanding of themselves and their struggle also to a more international level, and then trying to activate that so that it actually has an impact and makes a dent in the system, which really operates at an international level, often without any accountability to national democracies, right? And if you look at the way trade agreements are structured, you'll have a trade agreement which is negotiated by civil servants and politicians in a bunch of countries, then it's signed into law. Then you have a lot of clauses in the international trade agreements that are kind of open to interpretation, and there's a body of experts that interprets them. And so you have this self-governing system which dictates how things move around the world and where companies are based and how easy it is for them to register in one place or another place, which are not responsive at all to national democratic processes. And so the big struggle is to say, okay, if you're operating at the international level, then we're going to scale up our ambitions too, and we're going to fight you on your own terrain. And so the next step, and in the Green New Deal campaign equally, it is very much about fighting this on the European terrain rather than on national terrains. So next step is to take this thing global and to really see if we can push for a global Green New Deal in some way. But of course, that's another level of ambition altogether, and with its own challenges.
Yeah, that's great. I almost feel like we're at the stage. I have this I think I had this in my last, when I'm in my normal day job, it kind of feels absurd just to be kind of working towards something, knowing that the consequences of climate change are coming, and it seems that we all need to just put our efforts towards this somehow in any way that we can. It kind of seems like to work towards anything else seems a little bit absurd, just because it cannot exist without without an environment.
Yeah, that's the nature of this.
Yeah,
The nature of our economic system makes everyone do useless things that just serve the interests of the owners of the power in that economic system, and ignoring the work that really needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So join the movement.
So I think I think then we can wrap it up here. I'm just going to post a survey just in the chat, which is just about the event, and also if for future events. I think Pavel is potentially interested in doing some more talks with us. So if you have if there's like a specific theme that you'd like to explore, maybe that could be interesting. This is kind of more of a general one, but also just it's also interesting for us to know where everyone comes up from, whether it's Meetup or Facebook or whatever. So that's good. If you could fill that out, it'd be great. Otherwise, yeah, thank you all for coming. Would you like any final remarks, Pavel, before we close up?
No, I just want to say that I was really grateful you invited me, and it was really great to speak with everyone. And yeah, I hope to, if you want to get in touch, I don't know, Will, if you have any way of sharing my email, but I'd be happy to connect with people if, I'm in Berlin, you could grab a beer or whatever. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm happy to connect. I shall write my email here now.
Sure, do it.
And then I have to run for another meeting. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Don't get heat stroke or anything, because I might. And yeah, hope to see you again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's quite.
Thanks, Pavel. Great work. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much, guys.
Bye-bye.